everyone. Welcome to the Daring to Dad podcast, where we dive deep into what it means to show up as a father and a man in today's world. I'm your host, Ryan Walton, and this is a space where we get real about the challenges and triumphs of modern fatherhood, masculinity, and emotional resilience. On the show, we have conversations that matter with therapists, coaches, and everyday men who are daring to lean in, to grow, and redefine strength on their own terms. Because the truth is, being a great dad or a partner and friend isn't about having all the answers. It's often about being willing to ask the hard questions. Today, I'm sitting down with Patch McCormick, a therapist who's making waves in men's mental health. We talk about how he found his way from the high-stakes world of advertising into the deeply impactful world of therapy, and why so many men struggle to seek help, and how we can break the cycle of emotional disconnection. If you've ever wondered what it really means to be strong, stick around because this one's for you. Let's get into it. All right, here we are. Patch, good to be with you this morning. You're coming to us from across the country, Vermont.
Yep, currently in Vermont. Up here for some snow.
Excellent. That's great. Well, thanks for carving out some time to be with us on the podcast. I've been following you for some time now on social media and stuff, and I didn't
even know that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's great. You put some great things out there, and I love connecting with guys who are in this type of work, and I'm always curious about how men find their way into this work, because this was doing therapy and wasn't always part of your career.
Yeah, it was not. No, I mean, kind of like informal therapy, which I'll explain a bit. But yeah, no, I was formerly in. I ran boutique ad agencies for almost a decade, 8 years in New York.
What experiences pushed you towards the work you're doing now?
I think it's, a lot, but, I kind of reached a point in my advertising career. I kind of got to the top of my game, and I didn't really like who I was becoming. What's required to compete at that level within the advertising space. Maybe not every advertising space, but at least the ones I was in. Is just a kind of energy that I didn't love, and it felt pretty far from who I truly was at my core. And don't get me wrong, I loved many aspects of advertising and working in creativity and brilliant minds, but it requires a lot of aggression, workaholism, competition, etc. And I had also gone through a pretty bad breakup that got me into therapy. My first real therapeutic experience was in a men's therapy group in New York. And that was I want to say 2 or 3 years into my advertising journey. And I was hooked, like obsessed. I just was really attracted to the depth of it and the realness of, just sitting in that room with a bunch of other guys and going deep. It felt like real life to me. And like I was learning tools and skills that would actually really benefit me in my relationships. Versus tools and skills that I was picking up in advertising, which, benefited me in business, but were really not conducive to healthy relationships.
Right.
If that makes sense.
It totally does.
Yeah.
That's amazing about that men's group. Getting into that, I mean, had you heard of men's groups? Like what was your feeling kind of leading into that moment? Were you nervous about it? Did you have an idea of what to expect?
Yeah. So it was a men's therapy group led by an LCSW. I think maybe I mentioned that, but so it's a little different than like the men's work type groups, which we'll go into later, I'm sure. Yeah. Which I love as well. But the way it was pitched to me was, and there's two reasons that that was what I went for. One, I couldn't afford one-on-one therapy at that time. And this was a cheaper option, much cheaper. Like, I don't know, fourth the price. And the second piece that the therapist mentioned was like, groups can be much more emotional. Because there is kind of this shared experience, there's a shared charge, and you're interacting in a relational dynamic, much like couples therapy. And my challenges were I felt pretty numb and shut down emotionally. I didn't really know what I needed, wanted, or felt much of the time. I just kind of like head down, worked. And partied, those were my modes mainly.
Yeah. I know a lot of guys talk, like, men's groups are so powerful, and there's a lot of ideas around like what those groups are like, and there's a lot of different types of groups which we'll get into. But I'm always interested to kind of connect with guys on the edge, on the threshold of maybe joining a group, and some of the hesitancies and fears around those things. So I'm glad you had a good experience. I want to go back to kind of some of your career journey here. And again, I'm just so fascinated by how men find themselves in places such as yours. Like 25% or less of therapists are men. It's a female dominated field. I'm curious to know why you think that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of things that go into it. But I think on a macro sense, folks just don't feel, I don't think men think therapy is for them, is catered to them. And I want to say this historically, right? And a big part of that is just, relationships. These are spaces that, society has largely feminized, right? Talking about your emotions, going to a therapist was, I think, stigmatized and viewed as weak, right? So, that's as like a consumer of therapy. And then, flip that to the provider level. It's the same idea. It's like for example, I wanted to be a therapist as a sophomore in high school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I remember going home and telling my family that, and they're like, you don't want to do that. You can do that in any job, any profession, but you don't want to do it. Now, I don't know exactly what their reasons were, but, extrapolate to that to societal level. And the reason I went the advertising route, in my mind, retrospectively, was it was a more masculine path. Masculine path. And, I think that is really changing. I think a lot more men are going to therapy. A lot more men are, emotionality is being normalized on a mass scale, certainly amongst Gen Z. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's changing for sure.
Yeah, I do too. And one of the ways I feel like it's connecting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is that like mental health, emotional health, I think we're able to tie that into like strength and that mental resilience, emotional resilience.
Yeah.
Developing these tools and skills in our lives is connected to our ability to provide, protect, and thrive as men, right?
Yeah.
And fathers in the world. I think there's a sense that like women are asking for it.
No
in
kidding.
Some cases demanding it.
Of course.
Like, hey, this healthiness is seen as also an attractive quality to partners, mates.
For sure.
But yeah, I'm curious, and I think there's more we can do as a society to encourage men starting young into more like empathetic types of professions. I'm curious to know like what you think we might be able to do, to encourage more men to find their way like you did.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reframe that you just provided, that there's real courage and strength in turning towards your emotions and towards your relationships. And I'll kind of use myself as an anecdote. Pre-therapy, when I would be asked what I felt about something, there was a certain deer in the headlights feeling that I had of total incompetence. I don't know what you're asking me. I have no tools for this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that, I mean, and there's more that goes into this, but had me avoiding emotions and avoiding that feeling of incompetence. Avoidance is moving away, is fear, is backing away, right? And the reality is it had me on the defense a lot. And I think the reality that facing your emotions and learning about them and becoming adept and adaptive with them takes a lot of courage and can help you be on the offensive of your life and your relational challenges, right? And I think that is really huge, right?
Massive.
Huge.
Yeah,
I can't tell you how much more powerful I feel as a man. And it's not like, and I'm saying this as a frame for men, right? Because I think, and we'll get into like the ideas of power, flipping that and recognizing that emotions are power and connection, right? And health is a big deal.
Yeah. That is such a huge thing to understand, especially for those who are helping men, and the way that we frame questions, and going back to even this whole idea about like the way that we set up a lot of, therapy and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to go sit and talk about like how I'm feeling. Well, if I don't know how to talk about how I'm feeling, if I don't know the words to use, then I feel incompetent and I'm going to back away even further, right?
Of course.
Like that's such a huge thing that I think so many people miss, and maybe even in relationships we miss, right? Man, that's huge.
For sure. And I mean, I can't tell you how many stories I've heard of men feeling exactly that. Like everyone knew all of these words and I didn't know. And they felt sort of, sometimes in couples therapy, felt ganged up on because there's all this language that others speak and I don't speak, right? Yeah. Who wants to go to a dinner where everyone's speaking French and you don't speak French?
Yeah.
It sucks.
It's funny. I just saw the same thing. What I pictured was if you've ever been around people who drink a lot of wine,
right.
And they're tasting wine, and they're like, oh, it's like an oaky, and I'm these buttery notes, or whatever the words are, and you maybe don't know a lot about wine, and you're like, well, you feel that way.
Feel small.
You feel small. And then if you're in a place where people are talking about like emotions in a way that you feel on the outside of, how that can and yes, we need some resilience and being able to lean into those things, but it creates a higher wall.
Yeah, it's a separation, and what we're talking about is making men feel like this is inclusive of them, and they belong.
Yeah,
and it's an invitation, right?
Yeah. One of the things I've seen you talk about, and that's a challenge and a barrier for us as men, and as men culturally, is this idea of hypermasculinity.
Yeah.
Right? Big kind of, and I know that masculinity and these kind of things, big cultural conversations right now, and I want to weed through some of these words, right? Because I think there's a lot of things that are thrown out there, and even, conversations around masculinity can kind of put people's, defenses up. But
for sure.
For you, I want to talk about this idea of hypermasculinity and what that means, because I've seen you talk about this, what it means and individually and culturally.
Yeah. So I like to talk about hypermasculinity without gender. And I when I say I, it's me, and I've learned this from many big, brilliant thinkers. But it is more of a value set, right? That, and the water that we as a society swim in. And sorry, I'm talking about like patriarchal masculine values. Hypermasculinity is just the far end of it, right? So it's a spectrum. And to break it down, I mean, in essence, it's about power over others, okay? And some great thinkers on this are Bell Hooks. She wrote a book called The Will to Change.
Amazing.
Changed my life.
Yep.
It was so validating for me to read as a man, because she understood the experience. Like, oh my gosh,
it's wild. It's like the number one book I recommend when people are like, what do I? It's surprising
so
for people, but yeah, like it's incredible. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's like, oh my God, a radical feminist wrote a book that exquisitely saw the heart of men and what they go through. Terry Real as well is someone I'm a big fan of. She cites him in that book. Anyway, so Terry talks about men being raised to be competitive performers and not intimate. Okay, so when I talk about hypermasculinity, that's a value set, and I'll just name some of the values, and I think it becomes evident. Domination and aggression. This idea that if you're not a winner, you're a loser. Right. Hyper competition, hyper stoicism, and I'm not talking about stoicism of the Greeks, but I'm talking about like emotions are weak, numb them all, right? That's the hyper aspect.
Right. Yeah.
Hyper autonomy, so this idea of the lone wolf, depending on others is weak, right?
Right.
And last one is grandiosity. So grandiosity being you are superior to others. This idea of greater than, less than binary. You're either winning or you're losing. And, again, this is hyper masculine values I'm talking about. So like if you want to put an image to it, the far end of this would be someone like Andrew Tate.
Right. Yeah.
And I think we all live on a spectrum. And when I say that, I mean men and women and non-binary folks, because we all consume the same media, the same mythology, the same books, the same blah, 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 blah.
Right.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. It does make sense. Yeah. And I think we all can have, experiences, faces, things that come to our mind when we hear these things, and the messages that are out there in our not in real life, but also in stories, in media, in film, in television, and all these portrayals of that kind of thing. And so how does this impact us and impact both men and women, non-binary folks culturally? How does this type of being in the world affect us?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's on the one hand, we need to acknowledge like that there was a purpose, and there is a purpose for this value set. And if you think of war, if you think of sports, if you think of some types of business, some of these values actually make you perform at a peak level. If you're an animal, right? And I use that word, but very dominant, aggressive, hyper competitive, always winning, that can help you perform. And it certainly helped me perform, right? And when I talk about performance in the workplace, that said, it was terrible for my personal relationships, right? If everyone around you always feels like they're losing, and if you're always competing with them and making them feel smaller or less than you, right? If you're looking down on those that are demonstrating weakness in any way, shape, or form, I say weakness, it pushes people away. It's not safe. It doesn't feel safe, right?
So what you're saying, so in some ways, this way of being, this kind of, some of these hyper-masculine traits, like on the sports field or in certain areas, like might work out, but often that we don't know how to adjust and pivot and show up in other ways in other areas of our life. It's like we're just in this one mode, and that's all we know.
Precisely.
Yeah. And that can impact.
Yeah, and I think there's Bell Hooks has a quote that I really like, and she talks about the first act of violence that men perpetrate is that of psychic self-mutilation, i.e. they kill off the emotional side of themselves at a young age, right? Like I've talked about it, like around 15 years old, it happened for me. And that is the place with which you can start to abide by these values. Because when I was talking about like how you're affecting others, it's not just about how you're affecting others. You're also doing that within.
Yeah.
Right? If there's any semblance of an emotion that we've deemed as weak, like sadness or fear or shame, you run from it, you squash it, you criticize it, right? So these values can eat you alive, and they lead to suicide, social isolation, violence towards others. Like they can really hurt you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you, I'm trying to frame this question, people who might be embodying this way of being,
Totally.
like, how do you, one, recognize that it's happening?
Yeah.
Yeah. And how do people begin to make shifts? And I know that hypermasculinity you're talking about is non-gender specific, but
Definitely
I know
not,
you work
yeah.
with a lot of men. I work with a lot of men too.
I do,
Specifically, like, how do you begin to, one, identify this within yourself? I mean, for a lot of guys, it's just like, oh my gosh, I hit rock bottom and my shit's not working out and I got to change. Or like, is that just how it works for a lot of people in this situation?
I think that's certainly, yeah, I think that's the most common entry point is some kind of rock bottom, job loss, divorce, partner breakup, some major negative consequence that points out this ain't working for you. Right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a partner demanding. Sometimes it is, forced by matter of circumstance. Sometimes you broke a law, right? Or you got a DUI and hurt somebody. So, I think it's facing some kind of consequence that's really going to force change. Some people, just get tired of their own shit and, happen to find the right friend or the right partner or the right person that's like, hey, maybe you should try this, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's, becoming aware of it is the first step. And then having some kind of leverage that is, either positive or negative. You want to make a change so that you can feel healthier or so that you don't get divorced. And then, the following is just implementing the tools, right?
Yeah. I have found that we're talking about hypermasculinity. We're talking about some of the traits that you named. Seems to be very alluring right now for a lot of men, right?
Big time.
And
it's having a moment.
It is having a moment.
Big one.
It's interesting that I've even felt like some of that. Like I had this experience where I grew up in like this super conservative environment. Yeah. And I was a pastor for a number of years within the kind of the evangelical church. I left that, and like kind of my eyes got I was just enlightened by like a lot of new things in the world. Yeah. And got really involved in like activism and like kind of swung the pendulum of like how I saw the world socially, politically, economically, everything like this way in this other direction.
Totally.
Struggled there, kind of found some of the same fundamentalism and just intensity on that. And in the midst of that, I've kind of in the years kind of swung back to kind of I think a healthy medium. Yep. But I've noticed even in my own life, and maybe it's my social media algorithm or whatever, that feels enticing. Like I've even experienced that as much as I do my own work and believe in this, that we have to connect to all these parts of ourselves. It's out there and it's pulling a lot of guys in, because I think what you're saying is when we're struggling, when we're hurting, right? Whether it's economically with job loss or any of the situations you mentioned, when a message comes into our hearts and minds that says, this is why, here's where you can blame someone, here's what you can do with your anger, hey, pick yourself up, you're alone, do it, like, force your way back into the top, right? That feels very enticing right now.
Yeah, for sure. One, I actually had like a similar trajectory and arc. So I resonate with that, of swinging to the other end of the pendulum, and that being rife with fundamentalism and, othering and cutting people out. That's not healthy either. Not very compassionate. Yeah. But also this concept, Terry Real talks about it. He says grandiosity feels good.
Yeah.
People don't talk about that. But feeling better than others, right? Or, dipping into this men are superior or masculinity is superior and more powerful. That feels good, right?
Yeah.
It can feel really intoxicating, and it can impair judgment and all sorts of things. But I think, the other piece of this that's really important from a psychological level is that when we're talking about these fundamental extremes, they prey on the emotions of fear and anger, right?
Yeah.
And so when you tap into fear and anger, that is the energy that expends. It's kind of the quickest. It's the animal part of our brain, right? It's our threat response. So it expends the least amount of energy. Using your prefrontal cortex is harder. Thinking compassionately and seeing the gray area, the nuance, tapping into other people's emotional experience is harder.
Yes. Yeah.
It's harder. It uses more of our brain. And, frankly, our phones, everything is like gearing us towards anger and fear. And it's because it's easier.
It is. Yeah. It makes it.
It's lazy.
It is.
It's lazy.
Yeah. But I think that's such a powerful message that our ability to navigate complexity within ourselves, within our relationships, and to hold multiple things at once, multiple truths at the same time, and be able to do that's a certain amount of strength, and that resilience can help us navigate the world in a more healthy way, right? Because I think that's the invitation for men right now is to tap into like the fullness of ourselves. It's not to take away from anything that ways that men have valued themselves in the past, things like providing and protecting and all that kind of stuff. It's still that, and there are these other aspects of ourselves that we can begin to tap into, so that, like we were talking about before, this hypermasculinity idea, that we're just not one mode all the time, that we're able to navigate in a way from one way we might be at work to come home, and the way that we interact with our partners, with our children, all these types of ways is much more expansive. Yeah.
Yeah. It's more expansive. I think it's, integrated is more powerful. It's less teetering, right?
Yeah.
It's more grounded. And, I like what you said, and I know Dan Doty, who's I'm a big fan of, but he talks about listen, there's nothing wrong with some of the more traditional masculine ideals of providing, protecting, etc. We're expanding it, because the reality is our world has expanded. Society is different today, right? We need dual income households, and reality's expanded for women. It's expanded for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you can stick your head in the sand, but I don't know where in this country you can survive in a one income household. Yeah. And so therefore we all need to share these duties, and we all need to get good at new things. And isn't that great?
Yeah. There's so much opportunity there for us to tap into these parts of ourselves. I'm curious to know, practically speaking, when you're working with clients, and what are ways that you help clients unlearn maybe some of these unhealthy patterns, or what we're talking about? How do you help them open up more of themselves in addition to those ways that maybe they're already operating?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think there is finding your leverage point. So finding what is their motivation for change, right? Because what's in it for them? First, we have to find what's in it for them. Why are they there? Where do they want to go? What are their barriers to achieving the life that they want? And, until I understand that, I'm not really going anywhere, right? Or we're not going anywhere. But I think it's also just focusing on the carrot, right? Of this rather than the stick. And for example, I work with a lot of men struggling with avoidant attachment.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a post on this recently, but it's talking about how avoidant folks who grew up with, basically less emotional and physical intimacy, expressions of love, exploration of their inner worlds, they have very underdeveloped oxytocin pathways, right? So they're focused primarily on dopamine, right? Meaning like the chase, it's the neurotransmitter of the chase, reward, desire. So they're kind of stuck working on like obsession with work and short-term relationships. They often struggle with desire and, physical intimacy and long-term relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And they're only getting access to this one happiness chemical, right?
Wow.
And you have so much more of the happiness world that you haven't accessed yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is, oxytocin is the love hormone, and it's released in sharing intimately, giving and receiving help, hugging and kissing, right? Acts of service, and relationships. It's what keeps us bonded, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all of this not only gives you more happiness, but makes you feel a lot safer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're constantly chasing and you're focused on things that are not relational, actually your body is experiencing more threat, right? It's never feeling quite safe. So you turn to addiction, right? You turn to anything to help you feel a semblance of safety. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit now.
No, it's good. It's good. It's
Okay.
good. Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's like, and there's just like, this is something that is actually really hard in the beginning to actually see the payoff. But once you get about like 6 months, a year into it, folks can really start to feel those positive consequences, right? And they start getting a lot of great feedback. And I'll say that bringing in my own journey into this as a recovering avoidant attacher, it's not easy, and everything will point me in the direction of just focusing on the things where I know I can get quick wins. But the reality is my world is so much bigger today than it was when I was crushing it in the business world, but super lonely, addicted, right? And just relational life is so much richer, so much richer.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing, man. When it comes to, working through some of these things, right? No matter where someone might like find themselves, right? So you talk about maybe it's certain attachment patterns.
Yeah.
But we've talked about people in different situations where they're finding themselves at rock bottom, job loss, like divorce and stuff that like I have been through and found myself in a tough spot. There's a lot of modalities out there that people can find, right? And what I mean is like there is like you talked about you joined a men's therapy group, right? There's one-on-one therapy. Like there's coaching. I know that's been my modality. Like I have a number of coaching certifications and work with guys one-on-one. I'm right now back in school to get my license in clinical counseling and doing more of that kind of thing. If you're just listening, he's pumping his fist because that's what Thatch is doing. Let's talk about some of the differences, right? And where someone might take a look. I say this maybe more specifically for men. I think guys want to know what they're getting into a bit more.
Yeah, totally.
I've even noticed that sometimes in the comments on the podcast here and online, that there's this sense that I want to know what I'm getting into. Like, what is this going to be? And so let me talk about the difference between what you and I do with like coaching and therapy. What would be the differences that someone would need to know about those?
Yeah. First of all, I think that I'm a big fan of coaching. Okay. I'm a therapist who's a fan of coaching. And that's because, I know a lot of coaches. I've experienced coaching myself. And I think that many men will not go to therapy, but they will go to coaching, right? It's first of all, it's vocabulary that's familiar, right?
Yeah.
Oh
sure.
no, I have a coach, right? Like, yeah, it's sport. It sounds like sports.
Yeah. Kind of
Yeah,
coach. Yeah.
of course. Performance, great.
Yeah.
Therapy sounds feminized, right? Sounds like emotions, sort of this intangible space.
Yeah.
So I think, if I would say, from my perspective, therapy focuses a lot on healing, right? And emotionality. And, depending on the therapeutic model, many folks would say, therapy focuses sometimes more on the problem. And coaching is kind of more performance-oriented, solution-oriented, shorter term, not focused on the past, and maybe perhaps less emotional. Now, I know many coaches that actually are very skilled emotionally, but I would say those are the differences. I personally, my approach to therapy is very much, I'm kind of a hybrid, because I come from the business world, and so I'm performance and results oriented, but like I really like to go into the guck and heal core wounds and work with trauma, and I'm trained in a lot of trauma modalities. So I think just to kind of put when we talked about like emotions being this kind of intangible space that men don't fully see the benefit to exploring, I actually kind of think that's a dopamine oxytocin thing as well, right?
Yeah.
Dopamine is about reward and success. Where are my metrics? Where's my performance? Where's my gold star? Where am I meeting my goals? Oxytocin is more of this like intangible, right brain, soft thing that you feel. You don't necessarily see it, you feel it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's it plays into it as well.
Yeah. I 100% agree with you. For me, the coaching space is much more kind of like those short-term goal-oriented, hey, I want to achieve this. In my case, hey, I'm constantly fighting with my kids and I want to do that less. Cool. Let's focus on that problem, and let's in 6 months let's evaluate and see. Let's stack those things up, right?
Yeah.
I think there is a place for both. I think what you're doing is beautiful with like that hybrid scenario, because I think there is something about that connects with guys.
Totally.
It's like, I think a lot of guys go, okay, I'm going to go to therapy. I'm just going to go sit on a couch and like talk about my feelings until I'm blue in the face. But like, what do I get out of it?
Totally.
And so that sense of like, oh, hey, we can do both. We can explore the depths of where we've been and where some of these behaviors and patterns and thought patterns and experiences come from, and talk about how we can move through those towards achieving the kind of life that you want, right?
Exactly.
And so that's so important. And I'm even making that shift because I do believe that coaching has a space.
For sure.
And I've also realized that, like, I mean, there's a coaching boom right now, no doubt. Like, it feels like everybody's a friggin' coach. But
there's a therapy boom too. Yeah.
Right. And the coaching space is great. And I may get in trouble for saying this, but I think also can be problematic in the sense that there's a lot of people out there who know enough to be really helpful, and sometimes not enough that it can be dangerous.
I completely agree.
And how do you determine like what's that? And I think there's things in place, and we have education and a whole history and learning space to help people provide these tools. But like the thing is, like right now, anyone can be a coach, which is both like, hey, that's really cool, and is that what we want? I don't know. And so for me, I felt like my own personally, it was really important to continue my education, to always be learning, to continue to develop my skill set and working with people, and my understanding of the human experience and the mind and the heart. And so, but yeah, totally. I think that both can have their place for sure.
Yeah. No, but I think what you're saying is really important and worth mentioning for anyone who's considering either option. If you do go coaching, do your homework. Understand who's worked with these people and what kind of oversight is happening with them, right? And you can. It depends. It's kind of hard to tell that if you're not skilled in it. But yeah, therapists have a board that we answer to. Yeah. We've 3,000 hours where we're supervised and told, no, this is your shit getting in the way that you're projecting onto your clients. I don't know how much of that happens in the coaching world, but there's amazing coaches out there, and there are some dangerous coaches out there.
Yep.
And honestly, there's amazing therapists, and there are also some not great therapists out there, right? Like any field. But there are more guardrails in place for therapy.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I appreciate the work that you're doing. Man, we have 10 minutes left here, and I want to go through and maybe do some rapid fire questions.
All right.
With you, and just see what your hot take is on some of this stuff. What do you feel like is often the biggest misconception about therapy? And let's talk specifically in regards to guys.
Biggest misconception that it's not for them? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. What's a big mental health practice that you would swear by?
God, exercise and sleep. And these are not things you learn in school, but exercise and sleep are hugely important for us, and we forget them. Dude, but then if we're talking therapeutic modalities, I'm a huge fan of CBT's automatic thought records. Those are great. Parts work I use on myself quite a lot. I like modalities that you can just like adopt and start using on yourself. Journaling is a big one for me. So those are good.
I love that. Like it's so interesting working with people. It's like, oh man, I feel like shit. Well, are you sleeping enough? No. Are you eating well? No. Are you getting exercise? No. Are you watching are you managing your screen time? No. Okay, well, let's like there's these very practical things sometimes. No, I want some hey, if you can't do any of those things, like let's not carve out, half an hour a day for breath work. Let's focus on some of these basic things first, right?
Yeah. I mean, keep it stupid simple sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. What's one piece of advice for men who are hesitant to seek help?
Yeah. I get it. It's there when you're ready, like I think everyone is on their own journey, and I certainly was hesitant for a long time. It's a nebulous world. Just know that there are a lot of warm, welcome, open arms, and it can be pretty cold and lonely out there, right? It doesn't have to be.
Dude, yeah, 100%. 100%. Yeah, reclaiming your sense of, like impact in the world and all that kind of stuff is done in community, whether that's like a group or like one other person. That's often where it starts. And so, yeah.
I mean, I'll say like almost the majority of my friends that I've made in the past, I'd say like since 2019 or so, when I started my therapy journey, do men's work, male friends I met through Everyman community. Or therapy, the therapist community. And the difference in depth of relationship and what you can talk about and what I feel safe exploring, just feels so much more connected, and so much less lonely.
Yeah. You mentioned it before. You mentioned the Bell Hooks book.
Yeah.
Are there any other book or resource that you would recommend?
Yeah. So Bell Hooks, The Will to Change, by far number one. Also, Terry Reel's I Don't Want to Talk About It talks about the secret legacy of covert male depression. That one is hugely good. Yeah, I'm going to leave
Those
it
are
at
great.
those. Those are
Yeah, those are
awesome
great.
entry points. Yeah.
Man, this has been awesome. And I'm sure people are curious, like where they can connect with you. What are you up
Yeah.
to in the world? Where are you at?
Mhm.
Talk to us about that.
So I see men in couples, about 2/3 men individually, and then 1/3 couples. I'm licensed in New York and California. I live in Brooklyn now. I work entirely online, but I will start seeing people in person soon. You can follow me on Talk to Patch and Instagram and Threads. I'm starting to post again. I'm kind of like, I go in and out of posting, but I love it sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's basically it. I used to run a men's group weekly for a while. I'm gonna start one next year. I'm getting married this year, so I got a lot going on.
Congrats.
Thank
That's
you.
huge. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, it's really exciting. Joining that club.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
It's fantastic. Man, this is great. I love hearing it from guys who are in this work, and I think there's a lot of work that we can do to help encourage more men to connect to their hearts and actually like find professions and things like that
Totally.
are kind of empathy forward, human connection, like forward types of things. And I think that can start young. I mean, I have a 12-year-old son, on the cusp of teenage years, and observing these boys in school and the messages that are around them, like how do we do more of that? So I'm always really really fascinated by how men find their way to this work and how we can encourage that more. So thanks for sharing your story today and carving some time out to be on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my total pleasure. I really am grateful to be in community with you, and I'm super excited for you.
Thanks, man.
Going back to school.
Yeah.
I've also followed you for, I don't know, 5 years or something.
Oh, cool. Thanks, man. We appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you followed me for 5 years, I've been on a journey these past 5 years. So you've seen me come in and out of some stuff. So man, I really appreciate that. If you're listening, follow Patch on social media. Comment on this episode. We'd love to hear your thoughts and all that kind of stuff. And man, thank you so much again for joining.
My pleasure. I did want to say one more thing, if that's cool.
Yeah.
So you talked about like men finding heart-centered work, right?
Mm-hmm.
I often find that in terms of when we talk about purpose, men, everybody, there are kernels of who you truly are and what you truly want to do starting young, right? Mm-hmm. In my case, I knew I wanted to do heart-centered work in high school. Yeah. And I followed the advice of society, which was wrong for me. And it took growing into and actually looking at what the younger me knew was real to accept that. And I just encourage, like, if you feel stuck and like you're on the wrong path, a younger part of you knows the right path, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And that's just what I wanted to.
Man, that's so powerful. Yeah. That's so powerful. I may throw that to the very beginning of the podcast. Cool. That's a sweet nugget.
All right,
man. Thanks so much. Take care of yourself, and we'll talk more soon.
Yeah, much love. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Patch.
Bye.
Hey, thanks so much for watching, for listening. If you enjoyed it, one way you can support my work is by subscribing, by sharing, all of those things. Thanks so much. I'm incredibly grateful for your support.